versus a 6 year old. Just
When I told me, so we went to take
transposed to the
it's close.
Well, good evening. Welcome to Bible study this evening. Glad you're able to be here. Let's have a word of prayer to get started. Our Creator and our God, we thank you for the day again. It was beautiful weather this week. We thank you for your goodness to us in every way, for caring for us and providing for us. Thank you for time together this evening in your word. Pray your blessings on our time, that we will use it wisely to be drawn closer to you and to learn more of who you are. Thank you for Jesus, our Savior. Pray, Father, that we will live for him this week, and as you give us opportunity to share good news with others. Pray your blessings on all those in need tonight. In Jesus' name. All right, so last week we started into a new study. We're sort of looking at the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Pentateuch or the Torah, however you want to term it, the books of Moses. And we sort of did an overview of the 5 books last week. And we're going to do that with each of the 5 books individually. So starting tonight in Genesis, we'll do some overview things. These are big books with lots of stuff, and so it's good to have sort of a way to organize it in our minds so we don't get lost in the details when we're reading it. We're not going to be working through these books verse by verse. We will look at some texts in them, but just sort of selected ones. And tonight will be mostly the overview kind of idea. So we're coming to Genesis this evening. Genesis, that title, where do we get this term Genesis? Surprisingly, it's not, that word is not in the original. In the original English, yes, but Genesis is actually a Greek word. So there was a Greek version of the Old Testament. It would have been the Old Testament that the apostles and Jesus read. Septuagint, it's called. But their word as a title for the book was Genesis, which means origin, or we might say beginning. Okay, that makes sense. And that's the way we all grew up referring to the book, right? That's how we knew it. In the original, the Hebrew, okay, that is not the title. The title of a lot of Old Testament books in the original language is the first word of the book in the language. So the first word in show off in Hebrew is this word Bereshit, right, which means in the beginning. That's our opening words, right? So that's how this book begins. In the beginning, this word Bereshit, and similarly, like with Exodus. Okay, so Exodus, when we do our overview of that, we'll see Exodus is a Greek word. For instance, if you go to Greece and you see an exit sign, that red exit sign up there will say Exodus. All right, so that's their word for exit. But in Hebrew, the opening words of Exodus are, these are the names. Because it talks about the names of the children of Jacob, Joseph. And so the Hebrew title of Exodus is These are the names in Hebrew. That's the way a lot of the Old Testament books are named. But this is where we get our title from, at least. And it's interesting to me, we talk a little bit about authorship. We discussed this when we looked over the 5 books as a whole, but then again when we come to Genesis. So what about authorship? One verse we did look at last week in relationship to authorship of these books is in Gospel of John chapter 5, where Jesus is speaking. And he makes a statement about authorship, which to me, that would be really important evidence when I'm asking who wrote these books. If Jesus said something about it, I'm really interested in what he said. So in John chapter 5 and verse 46, he says, he's in a discussion with his opponents, basically, and discussing Moses with them. And he says in verse 46, "For if you, that is you Pharisees, you people who are opposing me, if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me." So, where did Moses write? Well, we said last week he's the traditional author of these 5 books. And Jesus says, if you really believe Moses like you say you did, you believe me because Moses was writing about me. It's pretty incredible statement. You wonder why they wanted to stone him, eventually crucify him. Statements like this to say, yeah, Moses was writing about me. That kind of thing. And then in verse 47, to close out that 5th chapter of John, he said, if you do not believe his writings, that is Moses' writings, how will you believe my words? So they would have all agreed at that time, Jesus and the Pharisees, that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, wrote the Torah, right? There would have been no debate there, even though there is today. But of course they didn't accept Jesus' point here, right? They didn't think Moses was writing about him, and if they would certainly be offended by the idea that they didn't believe what Moses wrote, which is what Jesus says here. But from ancient times, Old Testament period, New Testament period, but from ancient times, Moses was assumed to be the author of these books and the book of Genesis, really all the way until the 1800s, 80. Nobody ever questioned who wrote these books until the middle 1800s. And that's increased over time. So in a lot of Old Testament scholarship today, if you go to Harvard and study the Bible or one of those prestigious institutions, nobody there believes had anything to do with it. In fact, likely none of them believe Moses existed. All right? But that's, I guess that's neither here nor there for us. But I did want to mention it.
The problem with that is that then that starts, like you point out this passage, and that weakens the validity of John. Now you can't believe anything that's, how can you then, believe what John says is true, right?
Yeah. Well, how can you believe what Jesus says is true?
That's what I mean. Like, so here Jesus is saying that, and John's recording it.
Yes.
So now you're like, now the New Testament is starting to, and now you've got
issues.
Right, you got issues. Things are starting to
Got
crop,
issues.
right?
It's interesting that Jesus often comments on things like this that have become controversial now. For instance, one of the favorite Old Testament stories for skeptics to laugh at and say, well, obviously that's a fable, is the story of Jonah. Right? How can you believe this story about this man who was swallowed by a great fish, a whale, usually say, but the text says a great fish. How can you believe that? Well, Jesus assumed it was historical. You look up where he talks about that story. Because he uses it to say, just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the big sea creature, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in where? In the belly of the earth. He's talking about his burial and obviously allusion to his resurrection eventually. So you would think that he would want to compare the literal thing, his resurrection, his death and resurrection, to a literal thing, Jonah, the story of Jonah. But again, that's one of the favorite people used to criticize the Old Testament. Did I miss a hand over here?
Your comment about Jesus being in the belly of the earth, I don't remember seeing that verse, but it makes me think, because I went to a Lutheran school when I was in elementary, or middle school, and that was one of the ones that they said that Jesus went to hell and fought the devil and then ascended to heaven.
Right.
That's
one of the verses they quoted.
you know, that is roughly.
Well, that one I was sort of riffing when I brought that verse up. So I don't have that verse exact reference immediately in mind. I don't have it written down before me. Anybody have where he references Jonah? Maybe in your center column reference someplace or something? No, it's in there. Matthew 12:40? Okay. That's a whole other study. You know, I think he's clearly talking about when he goes into the tomb. But some people use that to teach something additional about what happened during that period. Let me give you a bare bones, simple outline of Genesis. Easy to remember. Two parts. Okay? So it's got to be easy. It's a 50 chapter book and we're dividing it into 2. So we start with primeval history. We used this term last week, primeval, first age. I like that better than prehistory. A lot of people say prehistory. But this will be chapters 1 through 11 of Genesis. And then the rest of it, okay, which is the patriarchs. So we've got the alliteration, P and P. Chapters 12 through 50. Starting with Abraham and going through Jacob and Joseph. That's one way to sort of divide the book in your mind. Of course, you have a lot more detailed outlines than that. So, good place to start. All right. Be interesting if the writer of Genesis, I believe it was Moses, if he had an outline. Like, was he working with an outline? And I think he was. And so I've given you a list of passages here that I want us to look up. There's 10 or 11 of these. And see how Moses seems to have organized the material. If he did it, that's really important to me as the inspired author. So there is this word that keeps coming up throughout the book, and we see it in each of these verses. It's a word that means something like generations. All right? The older versions say something like begat. So we might say begettings, that kind of thing. But generations is probably a term we understand better. It's a Hebrew word that appears throughout Genesis and seems to mark off sections for us. So what I'd like us to do is just notice these verses and see what it says. Switch colors here. Someone have chapter 2, verse 4. You can read it out loud for us. And
These,
Go ahead.
these are the generations of the heavens and the earth, when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens.
All right, so these are the generations of what?
Heavens and earth.
The heavens and the earth. The heavens and earth generations. So when you're in Genesis 1 and 2, we're talking about creation, right? Creation of all things. And at 2:4, it's the first appearance of this word. These are the generations of the heaven and earth when they were created. The heavens and the earth when they were created. If that was the only place it occurred, then we might not take notice of this. But as I said, see, throughout the book, in all sections of the book, this word keeps coming back to us over and over. How about chapter 5, verse 1? What's 5:1 say?
This is the book of the generations of Adam.
Adam. Book of the generations of Adam. Okay. Then it goes on, he says, when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God, male and female, he created them, so forth. And then we start getting into what we usually think of in terms of genealogies, right? So when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image, named him Seth. And then it goes on through the rest of that chapter, and you have a lot of begettings, or generations, right? So the descendants of Adam, these are the generations of Adam. Does that make sense? Okay. Chapter 6, verse 9, what's that one say?
These are the generations of Noah.
Noah. Why might you have to pause and talk about the descendants of Noah? You've already talked about the descendants of Adam. And Noah is a descendant of Adam. Why do you got to stop and talk about Noah a little bit more?
Because they reduce it all back to one family.
Yeah, everybody's been wiped out, right? So we're back to one. And so we get Noah in 6:9. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. It's interesting that same thing will be said of somebody else here in a minute. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So there we get our descendants. And we'll get that in a little bit more detail later. Okay? See how this keeps coming? It's the same phrase, same word. What about 10:1? What's that? I'm reading from the English Standard Version.
Okay, the reason I ask is because mine keeps saying the account. Mine keeps saying the account of
This is the account of Noah? Okay. What version is that?
New International.
New International, all right. There might be several different readings depending on what you're reading from.
I was just curious since everybody said that, and I was like, every one of mine says the account of. Is this the account of? But no.
Yes. That's what we have so many versions, sometimes we need to stop and talk about that.
Mine says the records of.
The records of, okay. The word is literally the word in the original. It's the word you would use to talk about, I had a child. It's the word you would use to express that. So these are the begettings, the bearings, and so the account of, it's the account of the family, or what was yours? The record. So you're making a record of all the children, that kind of thing. And you can see why they would put generation, because talking about succeeding generations there. How about chapter 10, verse 1? What's it say?
These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, and Japheth.
Okay.
The ones in the message.
All right. So You know, once you get past chapter 9 of Genesis, you're past the flood. So they come out of the ark, God told man for the second time, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so they're just starting that. And so that's why we've got another generation of Noah. It's really Noah and his sons. So Noah and then Shem, Ham, Japheth. And it's going to list a bunch of them in chapter 10. And even talk about some of the places where they went, which we'll look at a little bit more later on. But these are Noah's sons, of course. How about 11 verse 10? What's that say? These are the generations of Shem. Now, who is Shem? Not a trick question. Just read his name. So it's son of Noah, right? So I didn't write his name out here, but it's Shem. These are the generations of Shem. Chapter 11, verse 10. When he was 100, he fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. Then it goes on and says, now, why now focus in on one of the 3 sons of Noah? What's important about Shem? That's the line that we're going to start paying attention to, right? God's blessing is going to come through this line, so we're going to really start focusing in. In fact, we're going to get the next major character, Avram, Abraham, out of this line. So, you heard the term Semite? You've heard the problem more likely through the term anti-Semitic. Okay, so that originally comes from Shem. Shem's name. This is the line of, that becomes Israel, the Jews. That's where that comes from. So these are the generations of Shem. Now, a second time in that chapter, we get one of these in verse 27. Who is spoken of there? Terah. Who is this guy? These are the generations of Terah.
Abram's father.
Say again?
Abram's father.
There you go. So now we understand why we want to get Terah's line, because we're going to get Abram from that. Because right away it says Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran fathered Lot. Make sure you get Lot in there, because Lot's coming into the story, right? So we're working our way toward Abram. And so that's why we get his father's generations here, 11:27. And then it's a while before we see the next one of these. You have to jump over to chapter 25 and verse 12, where it says, these are the generations of Ishmael. Ishmael. Who is Ishmael?
Abraham's son.
The son of Abraham, right? A lot of times referred to as Abraham's other son. Okay? Not from Sarah, but from Sarah's sort of plan she hatched with Abraham. We can't have children, so how are we going to do this? We can't depend on God, so what are we going to do? And so they come up with a way. And you get Ishmael. These are the generations of Ishmael, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. Then it goes on and talks about his descendants. Okay? And tells you where they settled and so forth. So, if we get Ishmael, who do you think the next one might be? If it's in the same chapter.
Isaac.
Isaac. Right. So 2519 is the generations of Isaac. And this is, you know, we're not going to hear a lot more about Ishmael, but Isaac, his descendants, a lot about. Obviously, that's, again, just like Shem, that's the line God's working through. He's bringing his blessings through this line. So we get that Abraham's son, Isaac, in 2519, and how old they were when they had the children and so forth. Okay? And then we jump to chapter 36, verse 1. Who do we get there? Esau. These are the generations of Esau. That is Edom, it says. Esau took his wives from the Canaanites, and then it starts naming them. All right? These are the parts of the text that a lot of times when we're just reading through, trying to get through 50 chapters, okay, and we read the stories, which the stories are really important, clearly. We sort of miss these markers. You know, these are the generations of, these are the generations. But this is how Moses organized it, and sort of how he outlined it, you see. Because he kept using, he doesn't accidentally use this phrase 11 times. He purposely does. So we'll see what's going on here. Okay, so we get Esau. In fact, if you read just a little bit later in the chapter, in verse 9, a second time, these are the generations of Esau. So we get Esau twice. So if we get Esau, then who do you think the next one might be? Jacob, which is the one that's in 37:2. That's the one God's really working through, at least to bring his primary blessing, to bring a nation out of these people. So Jacob, in 37 verse 2. And really, by the time we get to chapter 37, we're talking more about Joseph, who's one of the sons, right? Joseph is 17 years old there in chapter 37. Okay, so this seems to be the way that Moses organized and outlined his material. So if you think about the book in this way, it sort of begins with we might call it a prologue, these opening chapters about creation, and then 10 of these are the generations scattered throughout the book, each one introducing a new person important to the story, most of them patriarchs. Okay? And if you were to ask Moses, what's your outline of the book, I think this would be what he would point us to. Questions or comments on it? It takes a while to go through that, but I think it's helpful to us. I'll tell you, if you memorize this, you've got the whole story of Genesis. You can hang all the other stories on it. You know? So instead of memorizing 300 stories, right, you can memorize 10 or 11, and then put yourself points under it, if that's helpful.
Mark?
Yes?
Have you ever heard of criticisms of the word or arguments about the word begat, where people will argue that that doesn't necessarily mean father, it means like could be grandfather or some like nebulous like oh okay, he's like some child way down the line of mine, because people are trying to inject more time into into these genealogies in this very, historic sounding book, they need more time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I've heard that, certainly.
Okay, what is your thought on that, like, Hebrew word, as far as, like, is there a justification for that, or?
Not based on Hebrew,
Oh,
I would say. No. Now, clearly, there's some times in the Bible when it says so-and-so was the son of, where it's clear he wasn't literally the first generation son. Okay? Not necessarily when it says begat, but in other cases,
Okay.
where just from other verses you can see, oh, that's a grandfather. Because sometimes, like Jesus is called the son of David, for instance. Well, clearly he wasn't
Right.
what we would think literally of. And there's other cases of that. So it's not always 100% literal, but in general, if you're using that word begat,
Uh-huh.
you really need a good reason to not take that
Okay.
literally.
Okay.
That's my humble and infallible opinion. Yes.
Well, I like the way you've outlined it there, but even like in today's history, like understanding who these people are and their families and descendants, it explains our political situation today, the Ishmaelites and Israel and Isaac, that their descendants, they're still at, and you can see where that conflict began and where it still plays through today, and the Edomites and the tiffs they had with Israel. So like understanding that really explains a lot of our current history.
Yes. And also, it makes you wonder, they're all related. They're all, trace them all back to one, and then they're cousins. Why can't they figure out a way to get along? I guess anybody in any family knows cousins don't always get along, but they can all trace their ancestry to the same place. The three major world religions all go back to Father Abraham, right? Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Islam also looks to Abraham as the father. They just think that God sent his blessing through Ishmael, because that's their line. Yeah, other comments? All right. So genealogies, a lot of genealogy, a lot of family. I mean, a more relevant way to talk about it. Genesis is about families, and these are families with problems, often major problems. The stories, narratives about families, and God working among them. So that's one of the major themes of the book, that one. Maybe the major one. Another one is this word seed, which is related, but you can trace the word seed throughout the book. Used about 60 times through 50 chapters, and sometimes it's singular, sometimes it's plural, so it might be seed, might be seeds. Usually when it's used, it's talking about somebody's natural child or their children. Abraham's a seed, that kind of thing. But when you really study all of the occurrences, it's interesting because it sort of expresses the idea that there is this close relationship between the seed and the one who produced it. That makes all kinds of sense, right? Let's talk to you fellow before church about their garden. You put certain seed in that, right? And it's related to what you got out of it, right? Okay, so there's a resemblance. At least the picture on the package, you got the seed out of it. Hopefully that's what comes out. And that's the idea in Genesis. It's not just talking about son, a lot of times the son or grandson resembles the one who produced them, who begat. And we're not just talking about looks, because we don't know what they look like. Except a little bit on Esau. He apparently was red. Esau. But anyway, it's more, a lot of times, a spiritual kind of thing. And so, let's start with the first one, Adam. The family lineage, the seed of Adam. As we follow his genealogy, all of these in Genesis are traced through male descendants. Okay? And they're all named very clearly. That's one reason I responded the way I did to your question, because they're pretty carefully listed, so it's hard to inject extra people in there. But the seed resembles what it came from. And then there's this idea that we see that the family exists because God has blessed them. It's the gracious activity of God that made the family possible. Look at some examples of that with me. I think it's important. Chapter 4, verse 25 is one. Adam knew his wife again. Of course, in the Old Testament, that is usually referring to a sexual activity of husband and wife. That's the language. It's the word to know in the original language, which other places just means, bring. But when Adam knew his wife again, she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel. Well, why did that have to happen? Cain killed Abel. Right? So, and we're talking about like the first generation of people, and you've got one that's murdered. That's pretty devastating. Would you agree? And so God graciously appoints another son instead of Abel. And we see the thing we don't know, when we read these stories, we think, oh, this happened, and then the next week this happened. This could have been, in their lifespan, hundreds of years separation. Right? Because they are recorded as living centuries, not decades. So, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. That word appointed, that's a neat word to study, because, for instance, a place that comes up is in the story of Jonah. God appointed a fish that came and swallowed him up. It's a special work of God. And here he appointed a new son. Yeah.
Can we go over briefly how people might have lived such a long time back then?
I guess we can go over it very briefly. So I can say, I don't know. There's all kinds of theories, interesting theories, like a different world, a different climate, not time yet for all the diseases to develop and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot of good stuff. But there's nothing like Revelation that says this is why. I always thought that was amazing when I studied it. And then when I got into graduate school, and we had to study not just the Bible and the families of the Bible, but the professors have these crazy ideas that you need to go study the Assyrians and the Babylonians and their literature too. A lot of them have stories about creation and how the world came to be and how people came to be. And the long lives are in all those. In fact, I think it was the Babylonians, there's a thing called the Babylonian King List. Outside the Bible, obviously, but it this the king and how long he lived. And those guys, according to them, were living 50,000 years. The longest living person in the Old Testament is who? Remember how long? Sharp. Maybe we need to go study some of these other people. But in the Babylonian king list, the certain kings 50,000, 35,000. So what I'm saying is that idea of long life wasn't unique to the Bible and to Israel. Frankly, I think the Babylonians stole it from the Bible story. That would make me a total heretic in scholarship to understand, because scholars, Old Testament scholars say, no, the Bible stole it from the Babylonians, which I call that baloney, which is a Greek word for fiddlesticks. But anyway, long lives are all over. And your question is good, it deserves a better answer. I could point you to some stuff that talks about it, if you're interested in following up. We see the lifespans drop pretty precipitously after the flood, right? And so they start coming down below what we're used to.
Well, that's what I was going to say. After the flood, it came down, and there was, a little bit of God kind of expresses his some of his disappointment with man, and you kind of wonder if he decided that it wasn't good for us to live so long. But,
and in fact, he says, God says at one point, their lifespan will only be such and so. But that seems to be the dividing line right after the flood. It's still it's a couple of pretty long, but nothing like 500, 600 or anything like that. The movie they made several 10 years ago or so on the flood, you can go watch that, and they got a theory. I think it's baloney, but really interesting. Remember that movie? I love the special effects, and I hated the way they told the story. It was so bad. But they made the flood look awesome. If you're in that story, I think they had people stowing away on the ark, if I remember right. Crazy. Anyway, okay, we're done. More next week.
That's great. I tend to work too. I get front door VIP service.
Put it in the car and
I've only like put it twice since they started taking